Students must observe lab safety regulations at all times.
It's the words of common occurrence that have different referential value.
The office said Dr. Smith will arrive later today.
Student Services provides help with housing and transport.
A study skills seminar is on for students who require assistance.
Any textual references you make should be cited appropriately in the footnotes.
The research paper should begin with a thorough review of the literature.
The aesthetic implications of this study have not yet been fully explored.
The inherent tension between these two features remains to be addressed.
Journalism is the collection and publication or transmission of news.
Milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. First, it is very grand, which most, especially later foundations, aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in the 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly, it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded, 900, 1,000, even in one case 1,200 years ago.
Corruption comes at a huge economic and social cost, and that cost is felt most acutely by the world's poor. Dr. Arnold has already given the staggering figure of $1 trillion US that's paid in bribes worldwide. It is an extraordinary figure. It's a figure that equals 10 times what is paid each year by donors in international development assistance, 10 times development assistance. And even this huge amount, $1 trillion, could be an underestimate because it's very difficult to capture a number of the more elusive transactions within the public sector that involve corrupt dealings, such as budget leakages and asset theft. Corruption sharpens income inequality, and it impacts disproportionately on the poor. In many countries, corruption works as a regressive tax on household incomes. Regressive because it impacts much more on the poor than the more wealthy. Compared with higher income groups, lower income families pay a much larger share of their incomes in bribes to access basic public services, and their overall access to those services is reduced.
This is Hans Krebs, who in 1937 published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions, by which energy is released in individual cells. It's called the Krebs cycle, which some of you may remember from your chemistry course in high school. Krebs is a wonderful example to me of how a scientist who is determined can overcome all kinds of human obstacles. Krebs' father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence and would never do anything important in his life as a teenager. What Krebs remembers in his memoir, his father said to him, "You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." And later on, when Krebs studied with the great biochemist Otto Warburg, Warburg also told him the same thing, not the same quote, but that he had only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. And we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children, but sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.
To which of our senses do all of the following words relate? Opaque, vivid, brilliant, shiny.
In a recession, does economic activity increase, slow down, or stay the same?
In medical terms, are antibodies harmful or beneficial for patients?
Would a person suffering problems with their vision consult a biologist or an optometrist?
Would fresh milk last longer in a fridge or in a cool cupboard? Historians use evidence to draw conclusions about the past. Would a contemporary artist's painting of an ancient battle be an original source or a secondary source?
What is the subject of study at a culinary institute?
Where would you expect to find equipment like microscopes, Bunsen burners, beakers, and petri dishes?
What is the name of the field of study that studies the human mind and behavior?
A planet or galaxy that is very distant can be seen with what device? What is talent? Well, that's a very good question. It's actually a very difficult question to answer. People in the business of writing about this tend to define talent in very different ways. Some define it in a very restricted way to apply only to the people at the very top of the distribution curve, the sort of alphas, the top-rate minds. Some completely in the other direction define it to mean almost anybody in the workforce. It's a synonym for workers, and I think the first is clearly much too restrictive. The second is so broad as to be completely meaningless. I think it does depend on context, If you're in a management consultancy firm, then talent really does mean, high-level analytical ability. If you're in Southwest Airlines, then talent means the ability to be personable and pleasant and crack a few jokes quite often and keep the passengers happy. But more broadly, I think I use the term talent to mean brain power. And I use the term talent worker to mean something like Peter Drucker's knowledge workers, not exclusively, but in general. I think the talent that really matters in the modern economy is the talent to use one's brain, both for analytic and creative purposes.
Okay, to understand what vitamin D does, we need to understand a central concept. The function of vitamin D is to maintain blood calcium. You probably think that the function of vitamin D is to maintain strong bones and teeth, but it does that by accident. Its real function is to maintain your blood calcium level in a very narrow range. And the reason for that is if your blood calcium level falls below about 9 milligrams per 100 millilitres, then you're going to get into big trouble and die rather quickly. And that's because blood calcium is important for muscle contraction and nerve transmission. And if you don't have enough of it, you can't contract muscles normally. There can't be normal nerve impulses. And this results in a disease called tetany, where you get these uncontrolled convulsions followed by rapid death. Calcium is also important for enzyme activity and blood clotting.
So let us begin by addressing the question of inactivity and obesity in children and youth. It's clear that in children and youth, more and more of them are by this definition of excess body weight. And we're seeing the prevalence go up. And not only in children and youth, but actually in infants, in tiny babies. 6 to 23 months. Look how over the last 20 or 30 years the obesity rate has increased. Now there's a whole host of issues about how do you define obesity in children, let alone in babies, but we'll not go into that this evening. You look at slightly younger kids, it's the same pattern, and then the 6 to 11-year-olds and even the older children. I mean, this is a phenomenon observed widely around the world, and from babies to children, to youth, and adults. All you have to do is, if you've traveled to the United States, say a couple of times in the last 20 years, it's very clear that there's an obesity epidemic there. And we're not quite number one. We're way ahead of you folks. You need to try to catch up and have the obesity rate move up a bit.
Well, the works of Shakespeare have been re-edited about once every 20 years since his own lifetime. That's partly just because as times change, the kind of information we need changes. So, for instance, a generation ago, readers could be expected to understand the allusions to classical mythology in Shakespeare. Now, most kids don't have a classical training, so we need explanatory notes for that. So there is part of the process is simply just sort of polishing things up and keeping the plays up to date. I also was very keen to take this project on because there simply was no edition out there that I thought was satisfactory. Quite often, students or parents of prospective students would say to me, OK, which is the edition of the complete works to buy? And I really couldn't put my hand on my heart and say, this is a satisfactory edition. One reason for that is simply the sort of technical reason that nearly all editions are printed in double column, which is terribly hard to read. And most complete works editions don't actually have the explanatory notes on the page. So there were sort of practical things.
Some years ago, Bjorn Lomborg, a young Danish statistician, published a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist. It became a bestseller and generated a lot of heat. Lomborg was attacked, abused, and accused of all manner of things, not because he denied the fact of global warming, in fact he affirmed it, but because on his analysis, the devil, and he says a lot of deviousness, was contained in the details presented concerning the size of the problem and what were the most responsible steps to take in response to global warming.
I think that's not going to be such a viable option for Cerberus, but that may be the way that they're going to approach it. Private equity, of course, is supposed to have the advantage of taking management out of the spotlight of quarterly profits and industry analysts and prying shareholder eyes, and that hypothetically gives them a chance to take slower, more patient routes to doing something to turn a company around. I would hope, and I have some, I guess, optimism that some of the Cerberus team will have some creativity and imagination.
There's another thing that's unique about positive psychology as a field of study. Again, it started in 1998. You see, until very recently, the realm of life flourishing, of enhancing the quality of our lives, has been dominated by pop psychology. Now you go to the bookstore, and the self-help section, huge, expanding literally by the second. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of books on the topic. You open these books, and what you see, very interesting, charismatic writers, good writers, but often, not always, but often very little substance. Then you go to academia. You enter a library, you open the academic journals. What you see there, a lot of rigor, strong empirical foundation, science. But on the other hand, not accessible. Most people don't read academic journals. What positive psychology does is create a bridge between the ivory tower and Main Street, bringing the rigor, the empirical foundation, linking it to the accessibility, making it accessible to students in college, to the general public.
The neurons in the brain cells, are like electrical cables, and they've got a layer of insulation like the rubber or plastic around electrical cables. It's a layer of fat called myelin that enables the nerves to transmit impulses properly. What the petrol does, it's fat-soluble, and it just dissolves that insulation layer. So basically, there's no sort of protection around the neurons, and slowly the neurons themselves shrink as well. And it makes you feel good, makes you emotionally feel better, strong, tough, smart. So the messages can't get around the brain and the body so well anymore. But the damage seems to follow a process. The thinking, the executive function, the more complex thinking is affected first. Then the memory and the learning and eventually the movement centers of the brain are affected. And that's when there's more serious impairment and probably less chance of recovery.
And one of the major lessons that we've learned is that diversity masks unity. And what I mean by that is that we are so attuned to noticing differences between things, and even differences between people, for example, because it's a tremendous survival advantage for us to recognize a lot of different people and know which ones are our friends and which ones are likely to stab us in the back. It really, really allows you to human beings to prosper. But that keen awareness of diversity actually masks some extraordinary, remarkable unifying principles in living organisms.
there are places on the moon near the poles where the sun never gets very high. It just sort of rolls around the horizon, and if the crater rims are tall enough, which is the case for already known craters, the sun never reaches the bottom of the crater. So it becomes what we call a water trap, where comets that might have impacted the moon and the like, water molecules can just fall into that and never get warm enough to evaporate out. And so as dry as the moon is, it may have substantial amounts of water trapped at the bottom of these craters. One interesting invention might be some device that reaches down into the soil, scoops it up, and sucks the water molecules out of it and drips it into a cup. And at the other end, you separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. That gives you rocket fuel. So the same machine that gives you the cup of water gives you rocket fuel on the other side. That's kind of an interesting device if someone could invent that, because then you take it to the Sahara and extract water out of the sands of the Sahara. I mean, imagine the kinds of things you can do with the technology that enables this.
Winston Churchill was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister in 1940, at a most critical time in English history. He was 80 when he resigned after his second period of premiership. Many other leaders, including presidents of the United States and dictators such as Stalin, have been leaders in their late 60s and 70s. This is particularly significant given that most of them suffered from serious illnesses. Even now, many politicians at both central and local level continue in office well into old age. There are other leadership areas where older people continue into older age. For example, in academic life, where writers and lecturers continue to act as intellectual leaders well into their 90s. In industry too, some leaders show
So often when we say the word activist, it creates this little box in our mind that certain people can fit in and other people cannot. And one of my experiences, or I guess one of my lessons from the various experiences I've had over the last few years, has been that every choice we make has an impact on the world, including when we choose not to do something. And because of that, then, if you look at it, we don't oftentimes see the results of our choices right away, and so we think that it might or might not make a difference. Like, what does this one choice really mean in the grand scheme of things? But because no choice happens in a vacuum, every choice has impact. And because of that, then truly we are all activists, because every choice we're making is creating.
Well, there's a positive obligation on the bank to ensure that the people who are signing a loan guarantee know what they're doing. Loan guarantees are kind of unique in that someone is giving security or a guarantee and placing themselves at risk for someone else, and they receive nothing material in return. So you've got to ask yourself, why is this person doing this? Do they know what they're doing? They're risking a lot and not really getting anything back for it. So the imperative is that the bank must ensure that these people know what they're doing and that they fully understand the implications of what they're doing, and they know that their properties may be sold if another person doesn't meet their obligations.
For some people, this proposition may seem far-fetched, but ending poverty is both morally necessary and actually feasible. All of us must play a role in making it happen. All human beings want and have a right to live in dignity, to determine our own destinies, and to be respected by other people. Despite the universality of these rights, our capacities to fulfill them vary enormously. And no dividing line is more profound in influencing the quality of our lives than the gulf between poverty and prosperity.
It's in financial companies' interest to have people save more money.
Further research should establish whether this trend is significant.
A gradual increase occurred between October and December.